Guten Tag, WAP. This is Mr. Liniger. Let's make history today as we go over Unit 4, Day 6. We're going to talk about the Russian Revolution today, which we talked a little bit about during World War I. It's a very important event. That's why we're going over it in more detail. It's one of the biggest and most important events in the 20th century, specifically the Communist Revolution. So let's get started with our daily punishment. I'm reading a book about anti-gravity. It's impossible to put down. Key terms for today: the Liberal Russian Revolution, Alexander Kerensky, the Bolshevik Revolution, or the Communist Revolution, Vladimir Lenin, the Red Army, the Cheka, War Communism, the New Economic Policy, Joseph Stalin, Leon Trotsky, the Five-Year Plan, the Great Purges, the Holocaust, the Wannsee Conference, Holodomor, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, the Bolshevik Party, which is the Communist Party, the Constitution of 1923, collectivization, and gulags. We're going to go over causes and effects of the Russian revolutions. So let's get started. So the Russian Revolution started in 1917, February. The big slogan that what led to it were peace, land, and bread. Russia was losing World War I. All their soldiers were they were losing a lot of soldiers. Their army was incompetently run. They didn't have the technology. The people were suffering in Russia. The citizens were suffering with famine, lack of resources, and consumer goods. They wanted to get out of the war. They wanted land reform. Even though Russia freed the serfs, like the land was still predominantly held by the aristocrats and the nobles. They wanted political reform. They wanted more of a democratic government. Even though Nicholas II allowed for the Duma to be created after the revolution of 1905, he could just get rid of it and didn't really have to listen to it. They wanted to make Russia a liberal democracy. And they wanted bread. Like the Russian citizens were lacking a shortage of food, consumer goods. What's going to happen is in 1917, soldiers' councils and soldiers are going to meet together and they're going to mutiny. They're called Soviets. They were groups of maybe mutinous soldiers or naval soldiers. And they mutiny. This is going to lead to the Tsar abdicating and the liberal revolution. The first stage of the Russian Revolution was liberal, so it was a democracy. Alexander Kerensky wanted to create a parliamentary government. He was a socialist, what we would probably call a social democratic, where he was a socialist. He wanted the government to be involved in the economy, but he did believe in democracy. He, however, wanted to keep Russia into World War I. He wanted to honor his promises to the Allies. And since he's going to keep Russia into World War I, he's going to lose a lot of the support he has. People are going to rebel against Kerensky on two sides. You're going to have the whites, who are the monarchist and conservatives, who are going to go against revolution. And you're going to have the radical communists, the more radical sides, led by the Bolsheviks, the Reds, who want to counter the white opposition and want to overthrow Kerensky because he's not radical enough. This is going to lead to the Second Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik or Communist Revolution, in November 1917. This will bring the Bolshevik, aka Communist Party, under power, under Lenin. He's going to do a coup d'etat, and his communist soldiers, his Communist Party, will get weapons, and they'll seize power in Petrograd, which is St. Petersburg. After this, the first thing Lenin will do was he'll withdraw Russia from World War I. He'll surrender a lot of territory to Germany. He'll surrender most of Western Russia, the Baltic, Finland, a good amount of Ukraine. The Allies regarded the Bolsheviks as dangerous. They were communists. They believed in no private property. They wanted all of Europe to rebel against the bourgeois governments. They believed in collectivization. A lot of democracies and capitalist countries found communism very dangerous. And they were angry at Russia for withdrawing from World War I. So a lot of them are going to favor the whites that are going against the communists, and they're going to give them weapons and even some soldiers to try to overthrow them. This will lead to a civil war. Many allies, Britain, France, America, Japan, Poland, will invade Russia to overthrow the Soviets. Initially, the whites, the conservatives, and the Greens, who were more nationalistic. Greens were more nationalistic. They weren't necessarily for monarchs. And also, Greens might be a nationalist within an ethnic minority. Like there was Greens in Finland, and they're going to create their own country. Same with Ukraine and a lot of these areas. Some of these areas will be successful in breaking off. Some of them will not. The Soviets, the communists, are going to win because of a couple of things. They're going to win because of the Red Army, the Cheka, Red Terror, and war communism. We're going to talk about all of these things. So, the Bolshevik Party was led by Vladimir Lenin. He's going to organize the party into cells and bureaus. One of the first things they're going to do when the Civil War starts is they'll create a communist army, the Red Army. This will be led by one of Lenin's right-hand men, Leon Trotsky. This is going to be used to further spread the revolution. It's going to fight the white armies. The Cheka will be created, which will be the secret police, which will do surveillance on its own people. Russia will become a police state. They'll arrest people, put people in concentration camps without due process of law. Russia will become a totalitarian government. War communism will be created during this time, where the Soviets could forcefully requisition food, supplies to support the Red Army. Russia will hold their first election, and that will return a parliament. The Bolsheviks were in the minority, so as a result of this, Lenin is going to shut down parliament and replace it with a Congress of Soviets made up by Bolsheviks, and he's basically going to get rid of any pretense of democracy. When the Civil War ends in Russia, Lenin will allow some capitalism in Russia because there's so much starvation. This is called the new economic policy under Lenin, where he'll allow some capitalism for small farmers and small businesses. Under Lenin, the Bolsheviks will create the Constitution, the new Constitution of 1923. It'll create the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. It'll grant universal suffrage to elect the Supreme Soviet, but the only people that could vote or stand for office were communists, were Bolsheviks. So it was very disingenuous. Like, they have a constitution, universal suffrage, but you can only be a communist. So, only one party is running. In 1924, Lenin is going to die. What's going to happen is there'll be a fight for power between Trotsky and Stalin. At first, Lenin had used Stalin more and more, and it seemed like Stalin was his natural successor. Under that, Stalin had built up a lot of power, but towards the end of Lenin's life, he kind of realized that Stalin was even a bigger dictator than him and was obsessed with power. So he wanted Trotsky. Despite that, Stalin will emerge as Lenin's successor. He'll use divide and conquer tactics to discredit his opposition. He'd built in a huge infrastructure of support in the Communist Party. So he will win. He'll eventually exile Trotsky. In the 1930s and 40s, he'll have Trotsky assassinated, and he'll create a totalitarian dictatorship. Stalin's going to focus on socialism in one country. He's not going to try to turn all of Europe into communist. He's going to worry about reforming and turning Russia into a totalitarian communist state. He is going to do some pretty big things. He's going to do the 5-year plan, where he tries to industrialize Russia in 5 years. He focuses on heavy industry, like machinery, factories, arms for weapons. He's also going to collectivize the agriculture of all the farmers. He's going to take all the land from the small farmers, and there's going to be government-based, like farmland, where all the farmer land is combined together, and the farmers all work there together. There's no private property under communism. Lenin had allowed still farmers to own their own land, but Stalin is going to collectivize it. So he orders the collectivization of agriculture in 1928. It will be large state-run farms replace individual family units. They'll impose collectivization by force. They'll execute a lot of people who they considered to be large-scale farmers, basically bourgeois entrepreneurs. They were called kulaks. He'll create a state planning commission and a series of 5-year plans. This is going to be government-sponsored industrialization. The government will pay for infrastructure and industrialization. It's going to be focused on heavy industry and not consumer products. And Stalin will be moderately successful with his industrialization. That's why, like, one of the puns that I like a lot is there's no room for Stalin when you're rushing to industrialize. You know, because Stalin helped Russia industrialize. It's a joke. Stalin is going to repeal the NEP. He did not trust private initiatives of capitalization. He didn't trust capitalism. Stalin was very paranoid. He was definitely a dictator. In the 1930s, he's going to start to purge all his opposition, real, and a lot of them were imagined. At first, he'll kick them out of the party, but as the 1930s gets to the end, he'll start executing thousands of people. He'll purge intellectuals and party officials. A lot of the old communists, the old Bolsheviks that led the revolution, by the 1930s, they will be executed. The ones that were lucky enough not to be executed, they'll be sent to Siberia into gulags, which are like prison camps. In the late 1930s, he'll purge the Red Army of officers. He thought the army was too reactionary. He'll kill more than 60% of his officers above the rank of major. One of the reasons Russia does so badly at the beginning of World War II is Stalin killed a lot of the officer corps. This shows a little poster of the people that were purged by Stalin. This right here is a comparison of the Russian and Mexican Revolution. You can see some of the big difference, like of who the leaders were, what their slogans were, what kind of government they wanted to overthrow, difference between communism versus socialism, and the events in the revolutions. This is something you should definitely know here. AP and myself like to ask questions about these two revolutions comparatively. Lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the effects of Stalin. Stalin is going to create a genocide. It wasn't necessarily an intentional genocide like the Holocaust, but he does a genocide. So the biggest example of a genocide is the Holocaust. 6 million Jews are going to be killed from 1941 to 1945. At first, it was very haphazard when Hitler started killing the Jews. They would just like mow them down with machine guns. In 1940, the major Nazi officers are going to meet in Wannsee, Germany. They're going to decide on the final solution and a mass extermination of the Jews. They're going to try to make it very mechanized. They're almost going to try to use like Fordism, where they try to do an assembly line of killing the Jews. They send them to a concentration camp. They take all their goods. They put them into the gas chambers, and then they burn their bodies. They try to find a scientific way of murdering the Jews. The Jews that weren't murdered or weren't murdered right away, they were used as slave labor, and some of them were used in horrible experiments where like they would put their body in cold water and keep lowering the temperature to see how much a human body could endure before it dies. This genocide that Stalin did was called the Holodomor. The Holodomor was a man-made famine. When Stalin did the collectivization, there's going to be a huge famine in the Ukraine. Stalin's not going to do anything to help the Ukrainians. He thought they were just lazy and it was their own fault. Like they'll be begging for support and food, and he will not help them out at all. He lets them die. Between 6 to 8 million Ukrainians will die as a result of the Holodomor. And that picture on the right is actually not a picture of the Holocaust. It's a picture of the Holodomor. There are other examples of genocides. You have the Rwanda genocide, which was made between the ethnic dispute between the Hutus and the Tutsis. And you have the Cambodia genocide led by the Cambodia Communist Party of Pol Pot. All right, guys, that's all I have for you for today. Until next time, deuces. Deuces, deuces. Yeah, Stalin.